Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Jaclene Jason. Jaclene is a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of addiction services at South Oaks Hospital in New York. Her team's treatment provides a holistic approach in helping individuals realize what a meaningful life in recovery looks like for them and helps each person to actualize that vision. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Jaclene Jason. Jaclene's work as a licensed clinical psychologist found her working with adolescents and adults who struggle with mental health. Now, she's passionate about the work, and it shows in her results, from managing anxiety, helping others develop coping mechanisms, and recovering from addiction or loss. She's seen a lot in her work. Now, during this Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to bring her perspective of working in the inpatient setting to the show. So hi, Jaclene. Thanks for joining today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, but now before we get into some of your work, tell us a little bit about, your work journey and what have you been passionate about professionally?
Sure. So just a little bit of background about myself. I've never went into psychology knowing that that's what I wanted to do from the beginning. I've always just followed what interests me at any given point in time. That is not a recommendation for anybody listening to the show, although it served me well. So I grew up in Long Island, New York. We're around a lot of culture and art and museums, and I just fell in love with art. So I went to college actually for art history. And while I was there, we had to minor in something that was outside of art and science. So I minored in school psychology because even though psychology is under arts and science, if you go into the school piece of it, it's under education. And while I was doing that, we had to have practicum experience. So I started to volunteer at this organization where children would go after school that didn't have resources and they would get help with homework and just learn different practical skills. And we were there to support them. And I remember I was working with this one young man who they had boating there. I went to school in Florida, so it's on the water. And he was just terrified. And we were trying to get him to go out on the boat, on the sail with us so we can teach him a little bit about the water. And he was just so scared. And I remember in that moment thinking, I would love to know better how to help support and understand what's going on for this child right now, which led me down a rabbit hole of trying to understand human behavior and mental health and anxiety specifically. And from there, I wanted to switch my major to psychology. And in order to do that, I would have had to stay in school longer, which I had no interest in doing. So I finished with my degree in art history and decided that I would pursue a PhD in clinical psychology from there. I've kind of just blindly dive into my interests. So, when I said I was interested in psychology, it was then you should get a PhD. And, from there, I've just continued to explore what within the world of psychology has interested me. So initially, I was really interested in working with adolescents who might have more like behavioral issues or legal involvement. And it's really expanded from there. I've worked with adolescents and adults who might have different types of struggles in mental health, whether it is in the realm of psychosis or anxiety or depression or substance use, and really getting an understanding of the behavior and how it presents itself and what we can do collectively to help someone interact with those struggles a little bit differently so that they can live the most fulfilling life that is possible in the way that they see it.
No, that makes sense. And when it comes to that specialization, right? You work with adolescents and adults who are struggling with mental health, as you mentioned. How does that show up in the inpatient environment?
So right now, I've worked in inpatient for psychiatry, and right now my role is in inpatient with adults that struggle with substance use disorders. I think the way that I think about it is in a few different ways. One is that we all have this biological difference. So two children or adolescents can go, or adults can go through the same exact experience and interpret it completely differently, because biologically we're wired differently. Our emotional response is different because we're wired differently. And because of that, we interpret things differently. So, Brian, if you and I are in the same exact room, in the same exact meeting, we might hear two different things, because the way that we're interpreting the information is based on our own history, our own backstory, our own insecurities, our own emotional response to the situation. I might hear like, you guys are doing a great job, and you might hear, you didn't do well because of this one thing that was pointed out, or vice versa. And the way that that presents itself for adolescents and adults that might be struggling is we might have that biological piece that makes us more vulnerable already within us, and then our environment might trigger some additional stressors that kind of pour fuel on that fire and can lead to a lot of suffering and struggles.
Oh, that makes sense. Now, this show, some of the origins obviously come from COVID, and it's about people who left their jobs. And in this series of mental health, I've been wanting to really just highlight some of the issues in this space. And so I want to take you back actually to March of 2020. COVID begins, the pandemic as we know it now starts. So tell us a little bit about how the pandemic affected you and your facility.
Sure. So I oversee our inpatient substance use program, as I mentioned, and we are a voluntary program, and we actually shut down our inpatient services when COVID started. We needed some of our staff to be covering some of the acute services that are non-voluntary. And also we needed to repurpose the building. So the building that we use for our inpatient unit actually was repurposed to house medical professionals that were coming in from other states to help support New York when we were in the height of COVID. So we were actually a housing unit for medical professionals that lived elsewhere across the country and potentially the world. So that piece had a tremendous impact. And then, I also oversee our outpatient services, and we had to go to telehealth and remote within a day. The benefit is that, we work in the space of behavioral health. So we were very mindful and aware and focused on research and how to best support the community and the needs around us. Because as we know, the stress and uncertainty around COVID just led to tremendous shift in mental health and substance use. And as much as that's true for the community that we serve, we also have to be mindful of ourselves as human beings. And, myself as a leader and a psychologist, I'm also a person at the end of the day. And our team are also people at the end of the day. So how do we manage supporting ourselves and each other with the demands and the needs of the community and the people that we serve in the roles that we have?
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I had a therapist on for season one who talked a lot about that. And throughout this series, we've had folks mention that it's important for folks to recognize that the folks delivering mental health services, like you said, are people themselves, right? And so how do we continue to support those folks, because there was so much that was happening at that time and even currently. So what were some of the things that you started to notice about your patients during this time?
I mean, when we talk about anxiety, what we're talking about at the root of it is uncertainty. And I don't know a time that we had more uncertainty than at the start of COVID. So we saw a huge jump in anxiety and depression. We also saw an increase in benzodiazepines, which is where Xanax lives, which makes sense if we're talking about an increase in anxiety. And we also saw, people drinking more than they had been. When we talk about mental health and substance use, one of the things that we know can be tremendously impactful in a more negative way is being isolated. Social connection, just as human beings, even if we're introverts, is just part of our nature. It's part of our survival. We are meant to be social creatures in a lot of capacities. So when we are more isolative, we often see people using again who maybe were actively in recovery or feeling more depressed, feeling more anxious. So we definitely saw increases in those areas. And then just the stress in general. So when we're working with adolescents, we're also assessing the stress level of their guardians and the people around them. Their environment is not just their internal experiences and their friends. It's also the people and their caregivers and their teachers. So when there's uncertainty and anxieties in the people who care for you, if you're an adolescent or a child specifically, that has an impact on you as well. So we were definitely seeing a lot of the impact of that.
Yeah, when you think about that isolation and like you said, addiction, people were drinking more, and it felt like different coping mechanisms, right? And so when we think about those things, what did you or how did you start, addressing some of those trends in increased drinking or increased use of Xanax?
We try and really help individuals to figure out what that is doing for them and recognize and appreciate the short-term positive impacts that some of those, they are coping skills, some of those coping skills have, and then figuring out and building more of an awareness of some of the like secondary negative consequences that some of those behaviors might have, so that we can start to replace them with alternatives. And also, we help people to understand the importance of being able to sit with the discomfort. So, a lot of where we see an increase in suffering happening is when we're in these painful situations that are unavoidable. Pain is part of our life. And we have this misconception that we're not supposed to experience pain, that I'm doing something wrong if this is what's happening for me, or that I'm unique in this experience. And when that happens, then we try these strategies to get rid of it as quickly as possible, which leads to a lot of avoidance. So a lot of times when we're struggling with that anxiety or that depression or those thoughts around uncertainty, or even when we're working through loss and losing people that we loved, the urge is to get rid of this as quickly as possible. And when we do that, we're left with all of those initial feelings plus the impact that it's had to postpone working through them in a healthy way. So it just prolongs the healing process. The difficulty with that reality is that what we're teaching people is that pain is inevitable and part of life, and there's no magic pill or prescription or remedy that I can give you right now that will alleviate this for you, which is different than other ailments in medicine.
Yeah, and that must be tough, right? So, and I like that mindset shift, right? Where someone's coping with loss, people try to avoid that discomfort, but now, no, what you're saying is you should sit with that pain and discomfort because it takes time, right, to move on from that. So I like that. And I think that in and of itself can be a struggle for people, right? I mean, clearly, and so I love that you all kind of work with folks in that space. What are some of the techniques that you all use to help people really kind of slow down and not try to get rid of the pain so fast? And I don't know if it like helping them slow down is either like weaning them off the meds or something like that. But what are some of the techniques that you use in that space?
There's a really straightforward and simple one, which is breathing. Breathing is something that we talk a lot about. There's a lot of research and support around it. We need to be breathing correctly, though. So if we're anxious and we're having short breaths from our chest, it's not the type of breathing that we're talking about. So one of the most effective strategies that we teach and practice is taking deep breaths, diaphragmatic breaths from our stomach that help us to regulate our physiology. When we're feeling overwhelmed, when the intensity of the emotions become to a point where they feel like they're just consuming us, we sometimes have this belief that we have to change the thought, we have to change the situation, or we have to change the feeling, the emotion in itself. And really, we don't. And sometimes we don't even want to start there. We want to start with being able to gain a sense of control over our physical self. And if I can control my breathing, then I automatically will calm everything down. The other thing, and we do this as a team also. So we start all of our meetings with taking a deep breath collectively as a team, as a way of just like, I'm in this moment now. Whatever happened earlier, not relevant in this space. Whatever I have to do next, not relevant in this space. As a team, let's just take a deep breath and be in this moment together right now. It's also a really portable skill, which makes it very helpful. There's a lot of discussion in recent years, obviously, around mindfulness as well. And the idea is that mindfulness is not the same as meditation. And the goal is not to be calm. It's just to be aware. So if I'm struggling right now, I want to be able to build an awareness of of what my thoughts and feelings and struggles lie, without overly attaching to them. So what mindfulness, the goal is for us to be able to just notice without judgment about it. So it's not that I'm noticing that I'm too anxious, it's that I'm noticing the experience of anxiety. And that shift in language and how we're connecting to it, the shift from being consumed by it by saying I'm anxious to being able to observe it as this is anxiety, and I can just with curiosity investigate it, gives me space to recognize that I am myself outside of this current experience. And that's the goal of mindfulness. The other goal with being able to do that is that it allows us to do something next about it. So if instead of saying I'm anxious, if I'm able to take a step back and recognize with curiosity, like, oh, this is anxiety, this is what's going on for me, I have the urge to get rid of this as quickly as possible. This is uncomfortable and sucks. If I'm able to just notice those things and say, okay, I'm going to take a few deep breaths. What else can I do? Maybe I'm going to, maybe my urge is to go drink or take a pill to get rid of this as quickly as possible. I'm just going to notice that urge, and maybe I'm going to call a friend or read this book or just sit still and just focus on my breathing for 10 minutes and just with curiosity notice my discomfort. Whatever that thing is, it allows me to purposefully do it instead of it being reactionary.
I love that. The level of intentionality associated with that, and like to your point, awareness is something that really resonates with me. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So now in your work, you help people become more comfortable in their vulnerability. So how have you done this in your practice?
So I think one of the ways that we help people be more vulnerable is modeling vulnerability. So for me particularly, I have to be willing to admit when I'm wrong, which makes me feel vulnerable. Or, the example that I give a lot when I'm working with individuals is that I am a terrible speller. And I struggled with, I wasn't a great student. I like learning a lot, and the way that I learn is different than what would constitute a great student. And I had some insecurities about that. So when I started in this field, for example, I would talk around using specific words. So instead of saying like that they might be experiencing anxiety, I would be so worried that I'd be wrong that I would say like, these are the things that they are experiencing. And I would allow the other person to fill in the word. When I started to be more willing to be vulnerable and recognize it as an opportunity for growth, then I started to use the words, whether they were correct or not, and ask for clarification. I'm using this word, is it correct? Or even in group, I'll ask, how do you spell? And it will be a word that might be at a kindergarten level because I am a terrible speller. And they might laugh at me. And that is okay. I get to model that I can own my own vulnerabilities. And it's not a reflection of the things that I might feel like it is a reflection of. So if I struggle, for example, with like feeling like I'm not good enough or smart enough or whatever those insecurities might be for myself, which will be different for everybody else, if I'm able to own those vulnerabilities and express them and allow other people into that experience with me, then I'm able to grow through them, not necessarily get rid of them. Just by having this mindful awareness of them, they no longer control my behaviors, my sense of myself, or my ability to maneuver in my life. When we started talking earlier, we were talking about that biological difference, and that combined with our different experiences and our backstories, and those all lead to us having different vulnerabilities about what might push our own internal buttons or sensitivities. So what we want to be able to do is build an awareness about that. So there was research, I don't remember who conducted it. What the research said is that when we're going about our everyday life, that we actually have the perception that people are paying less attention to us than they actually are. So if I walk onto a unit or into a meeting, or I get home from work and I walk into my house and my children come to greet me, if I'm on my phone answering emails, on a call, if I am not paying attention, I might think that those things are not recognized because everyone's interacting in their own lives. whereas they are noticed. The alternative to that, though, is that when it's an area that we're more vulnerable about, that gives us more of our own insecurity coming up, then we actually think people are more attuned to it than they are. So if I said something that I'm like, that was stupid, what I just said was nonsense, and I can't believe that came out of my mouth, I might think everyone in the room is judging me right now, is thinking about how stupid that comment was, and no one noticed. No one thought twice about it. If they did, maybe they were like, I don't get it, and then moved on. For me, maybe like it's the next day and I'm still like, I can't believe that that came out of my mouth. So understanding that about ourselves allows us to kind of work through that vulnerability in two ways. One, it makes us show up the way we want to on a daily basis because we are socially interacting with other people and they're seeing us more than we recognize. So we really need to model these things. And two, that our vulnerabilities, our vulnerabilities, they do not define us. And other people generally are not noticing the way that we think they're noticing. And when we open up to it, we actually are able to build a different sense of connection.
I love that. And now, throughout my show, not only this series, but season one, too, mental health has been really a prevalent topic, which is why I really, sparked and I'm doing this series. So with anxiety, right, in all of its forms, that has been one of the most consistent themes, and it's come up multiple times during our conversation. And so, how much are people in society impacted by or with anxiety?
I would say the research significantly underestimates how many people struggle with anxiety because there's a normal amount of anxiety that every single human being needs to experience, and it gets a bad reputation. So if we're talking about how many people experience anxiety, it's a different conversation than how many people struggle with anxiety. If going back to what we talked about earlier, if you and I experience the same amount of anxiety from a physiological standpoint and response, the way that we respond to it, the way that we practice self care, the way that we stay in control of our behaviors, the way that we label it impacts whether it becomes problematic for us or not. So, for example, when I was preparing mentally for today, I was, going through some of the thoughts that go with like, what if I do a terrible job or don't say the right thing or say something that I later regret and can't take back, whatever those things are, and feeling like, physiological feelings like heart racing. I could say, I'm really anxious about this. I could call out sick today and I could not volunteer to do this podcast, for example. Or I could recognize that that is excitement, that I get to do something new and challenging, and that it's awesome that, with my career trajectory and life trajectory, that I have the opportunity to do things that excite me and that are new. Same physiological experience, same thought process, the perspective of it shifts. And there's actually a lot of research about this for athletes. So the difference between high performers or like professional athletes and people who might have the same skill level who aren't meeting that potential, one of the things that they look at is their perception of those physiological arousal experiences that we see a lot with anxiety or excitement.
That's awesome. So when you think about some of the positive ways that anxiety can be addressed, is it really almost that reframing of the moment or the potential situation?
It depends. And because it depends, it's helpful for us to recognize that. So we can reframe in a situation. And then there's situations that are going to be where anxiety is more appropriate than excitement. If I'm going in for a procedure, I'm not excited about that. And it's normal and reasonable to be anxious about it. The idea is that we can tolerate and sit with the anxiety. We can find a place for it without it overtaking us or consuming our behavior. So biologically, anxiety is wired within us because it's protective and it keeps us alive, and we want to have anxiety. Like if I'm not anxious about my health, I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm never going to go to a doctor. Anxiety might fuel that. Other things might also, like, value of what it feels to be physically well or whatever else might be connected to that. And to your point earlier, anxiety does motivate healthy, helpful behavior. The problem is when we misunderstand anxiety and we underestimate our capacity to get through it.
That makes a
And
lot of
the
sense.
other piece of it from a behavioral health standpoint is that for some people, medication is what's helpful and needed, not necessarily these short-term medications that get rid of the anxiety as quickly as possible. We're not talking about being on those every single time we feel anxious for the entirety of our life. And for some people, the experience of that underlying ongoing anxiety and depression, like there are medications that are really helpful to just kind of take that edge off enough so that we can have enough space to use our skills and be resourceful.
I appreciate that. Now, kind of taking it back to, let's talk a little about work now. So work is often, very often, a source of anxiety for many. And so how do you think the continued adoption of remote work will help reduce those feelings, if you think they'll reduce them at all?
I don't think they do. I think at a surface level, they do. And I think for some people, depending on what else they have going on in their life and their other responsibilities, pieces of it do. I think for the consumer, it eases access in some ways that can be helpful. And I also think that going back to that sense of isolation and connection, it's important to feel a part of something and recognize your place in it larger than yourself. And again, it depends on your world. I can't speak to, for example, like people who work in tech or software who might be like programming all day, which maybe there's less. I honestly just don't know. Maybe there's less of that sense of being part of the team and interacting in a social capacity, although I wouldn't imagine that that's the case. So I think that the idea is that having the capacity to do things remotely is helpful in terms of access. And we also want to be really aware and mindful that ease doesn't mean better. So even if something is easier, it doesn't mean that it's fulfilling these other areas that are important for me to feel connected and balanced. In that capacity, having some opportunities to come together and be part of your larger understanding your value in what the work you're doing in a larger capacity, the impact that you're having, how it aligns with your values in a different area. I think there's a lot of value to being in the field, whatever that means within everybody's respective areas.
No, I agree. And, I actually recently saw some research about that was speaking just to that the isolation, I think it was a New York Times article that came out recently, but that the isolation of remote work is actually, doing more harm than good, right? In so many words. And so I think you'll start to see more of that type of research come out. Look, I think the future is hybrid, right? I think that balance, to your point, access is key. And sometimes, you need that flexibility. But that hybrid model is something that gives people, the best of both worlds. Because to your earlier point as well, that connections piece, we are social creatures, right? And so and sometimes that in-person connection is really what matters. A part of the show I love to get to, and I have all my guests kind of go through this, is really the advice section, right? And so when we think about what we're talking about in this space, what are ways, we talked about pain earlier and suffering, but what are ways people can effectively address handling pain and or suffering?
So one way is accepting that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Meaning, if we allow ourselves to experience the pain, we don't add the secondary suffering that happens when we're trying to escape it as quickly as possible. So, acceptance is huge. We also want to accept that negative emotions are part of our experience. Even using the word negative might be less than ideal. So, unpleasant emotions that are causing us discomfort are inevitable. So we can also find a place of acceptance around that experience as human. I think another thing that's really helpful is recognizing that our thoughts are not facts. So one piece of advice is when we're having thoughts, taking a step back and recognizing it as a thought and not as a fact. Going back to the conversation we had earlier about vulnerability, is our thoughts tell us these things. Our thoughts tell us you're not good enough, you're going to fail, everyone's judging you, whatever those sensitivities are for us. They're not facts, they're just thoughts. And as human beings, we spend a lot of time trying to find the answer. And that causes a lot of suffering. Sometimes we want to do that investigatory work because it helps us to grow. And sometimes it just keeps us stuck. And we can just acknowledge that this is a thought and not a fact. And then the question we get to ask ourselves is this helpful for me? So we're moving away from saying, is this true or false? And we're moving towards, is this helpful? If it's helpful for me to try and figure out something from a growth perspective, then yeah, I'll keep going with that thought and investigating it. If this is not helpful for me, then I get to just recognize it as a thought, not a fact, and move on with my day. The way that I always teach it is the way that I personally practice it, which is when I'm having these thoughts, I say to myself, literally, thank you, brain, for doing what you do and coming up with thoughts, moving on. And then I go back to whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish or working on or the conversation I'm having, because it is what our brains do. And when we give ourselves the space to recognize that our thoughts are thoughts and not facts, it gives us the ability to decide what direction we're going to take ourselves in our lives, because we get to move ourselves towards our valued life. Our thoughts, our insecurities, our fears do not get to guide us. We get to guide ourselves based on our values.
I like that a lot. And, when you think about, let's say, 5 key things, we talk about emotions now, right? 5 key things people could do to manage difficult emotions. What would you suggest?
Number one, breathe. There are a ton of different breathing strategies. I would say find a specific breathing strategy, whether it's taking 3 deep breaths, whether it's counting your inhale and your exhale. Find specific breathing strategies that work and breathe. I would also say in those moments when you're experiencing that intense emotion, thoughts are usually going along with it. So being able to recognize thoughts are thoughts and not facts. Another strategy I would say is moving your body. So there's a physiological component to intense emotions. Like we talked about earlier, biologically, it has kept us in survival mode by fight, flight. We're responding to the perception of a threat, which has a physiological nervous system response to it. And because of that, if we allow ourselves to move through it physiologically, it allows us to move through that stress cycle. So if we're experiencing a lot of intense feelings after we've maybe sat with it, experienced it, we can do something to move our body and allow the physiological piece to work itself through as well. Go for a walk, go for a run, do yoga, move your body, bounce on a yoga ball, whatever it means. I think also recognizing, like we talked about, that these things are fleeting. So, if we're in a recovery mindset, the way that we talk about it is this too shall pass. From a skills perspective, we talk about it in the sense of urge surfing. Either way, whatever words we use, the concept is that we know that this will pass. So in those moments that feel really intense, recognizing, one, I don't need to run away from it. I can sit with it. It will pass. I can take a few deep breaths. I can move my body.
Love that. And now during Mental Health Awareness Month and BIPOC Mental Health Month, how can we help the message about the resources available in this space?
I think that talking about it is really important and helpful. There are different things that are helpful and therapeutic for different people. Going to therapy is one avenue. Obviously, as a therapist, it's one that I see value in and recommend for people, not all people. So I think just being able to explore, talk to friends, family, coworkers, go online, see what's available. There's a lot of commercials for different resources. I work at South Oaks. We're part of a larger health system of Northwell. We have a number that you can call to be connected to care, and a lot of organizations have similar frameworks. During COVID, there was a response of the state, at least in New York, starting different like crisis and call lines. So there are people that are available to support mental health. There's also people that are available to help support how to understand and have access to resources differently, because it honestly can be really challenging. It can be really challenging to figure out how to navigate that space. So the shortest advice would be that there's no wrong place to start, and that sometimes it does take making a few phone calls, clicking a few buttons online to find the right connection for you.
And now, last question, what type of impact are you hoping to have on your patients in the future?
I think that the impact that that I hope to have in general is just being able to continue to explore and be curious about what motivates people, how things work in general, people being part of that, and helping to just optimize living and working fully. So the impact that I would hope to have is helping people to recognize and realize what it looks like to be living a fulfilling life.
Like that. Well, look, Jaclene, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to visit the show. I enjoyed learning more about you and your practice and how you navigate some of these mental health issues. So, where can our listeners find you and support you?
They can find me and support me on LinkedIn, Jaclene Jason, and also if anyone's more interested in the programs that I'm directly a part of. Again, I'm part of South Oak, so we have our own website, and they can find me there as well.
Very nice. All right, so that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank my guest, Jaclene Jason, for joining us today. Her information will be in the show notes. And look, I hope you all have a great week. Next week, we'll be wrapping up our mental health series. And so this has been a great forum. And I appreciate, again, Jaclene, for joining. So hope you all, again, have a great week. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again, Jaclene.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.